Welcome to the Veritas Forum, engaging university students and faculty in discussions about life's hardest questions and the relevance of Jesus Christ to all of life.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here. I want to thank the organizers and the sponsors for the opportunity to be part of this discussion about is there truth beyond science? What I mean by science is natural science, the sorts of things that are discovered by physics, chemistry, biology, geology, astronomy, and so on. Now that might seem obvious to some people, but a lot of confusion arises because long ago that was not the meaning of the word science. In the 18th century, the word science was used to speak about any systematic knowledge. After all, the meaning of the Latin word scientia, from which science is derived, is simply knowledge. But today, that is not what people mean by science. When using the unqualified word science, people mean, and I mean, natural science. It is natural science that has gained enormous epistemological prestige based on its amazing success in describing the natural world and upon the powerful technologies that it has spawned. Now, I'm not going to unpack in detail what makes natural science what it is. If you want all the details, please read my book. But most people realize that there are certain characteristics and strategies that science adopts for obtaining its knowledge that are the basis for its success. And I identify those strategies in two ways. It's a reliance upon reproducibility, that different people in different places can get the same result when repeating an experiment, and secondly, or can observe the same observations. And secondly, an insistence upon descriptive clarity that gives unambiguous descriptions of the results of an experiment, so that even if its interpretation is not ambiguous, scientists can agree upon and understand what the results are. And my book is an examination of scientism, the belief that all the real knowledge there is science. Scientism has been enormously influential in our society and especially in the academy for a couple of hundred years, not just in scientific disciplines, but in many disciplines that don't really lend themselves to the methods of the natural sciences, but in many cases have tried in vain to turn themselves into science by using those methods. And scientism is actually usually implicit rather than explicit. What I mean is that people don't generally declare an allegiance to scientism. More often, they simply presume it implicitly. Now, one recent example of explicit scientism, though, is from the book by the philosopher Alex Rosenberg. It's entitled The Atheist's Guide to Reality. And he defines scientism just as I do. He calls it, quote, the conviction that the methods of science are the only reliable ways to secure knowledge of anything. He advocates it, saying, science provides all the significant truths about reality. And in case you hadn't any remaining doubt, he goes on to say, once you adopt science, you'll also be able to cease treating the humanities as knowledge. That's pretty straightforward. Now, Rosenberg is far from being the first person to adopt scientism. It's very common in the writings of many of the militant atheists of this century. For example, Richard Dawkins, in his book, The God Delusion, writes as follows. Did Jesus raise Lazarus from the dead? Did he himself come alive again 3 days after being crucified? There is an answer to every such question. whether or not we can discover it, and it is strictly a scientific answer. The methods we should use to settle the matter would be purely and entirely scientific methods. But I'm grateful to Rosenberg for his very explicit claims because they seem to me to highlight the foolishness of a scientistic position like that of Dawkins. If you adopt scientism, you'll be forced to discount the actual methods of history, for example, in the way that Dawkins does, and pretend that questions of history are decided by science. But of course they aren't. And since history isn't really like natural science, if you maintain your scientism, you end up discounting history's knowledge. The way that you establish the truth of an historical claim, like the resurrection, or, for example, Julius Caesar was assassinated on the steps of the Roman Senate on the 15th of March in 44 BC, is of course not by, quote, purely and entirely scientific methods. No, we need to use methods that are appropriate to the claim that is being made. The evidence that we're going to seek for historical claims isn't mostly scientific evidence, it's historical evidence. This might be predominantly documentary or personal or eyewitness testimony. Perhaps there might be some archaeological evidence. And this will all be gathered together, taking advantage of our general understanding of what makes people tick and the attitudes and the thinking and the background history of the times in which the event occurred. The reason that scientism is so important in this present discussion is that the critics of belief in God are very fond of saying that religion is irrational because there's no evidence for God. But what they're really saying is that there's no scientific evidence for God. There's plenty of historical evidence concerning the claims of Christianity, but I will agree that history and the truth of Christianity cannot be established scientifically. But my position is that science is plainly not the only route to knowledge. Scientism is simply a mistake. And the most important clarification in understanding the relationship between science and faith is to recognize that there are many different routes to knowledge, and science is just one of them, albeit a very powerful one, but just one. And if you artificially elevate science into a monopoly of knowledge, then you undermine religion, but you also undermine lots of other non-scientific disciplines like history or philosophy or literature or the law or economics and so on. Now, the organizers of this forum specifically asked me, as part of this lead-off, to speak personally about how I came to believe in Jesus and why I find Christianity compelling. And I take this request to be linked to this question of truth beyond science, the truth of Christianity. So, I grew up in England, as my accent perhaps still betrays. My parents were not Christians. My family did not go to church. And though I was, for roughly a year at age 8, sent to Sunday school, that was mostly to give my mother a couple of hours of freedom during the weekend. I decided early on that God was at best not relevant and probably not there. I was exposed to outward forms of religion at my high school, which was adjacent to Worcester Cathedral, and on occasions it required the students to attend the services. And I wasn't totally ignorant of the Bible either, because I decided that the Bible's foundational role in Western culture made the New Testament an appropriate optional extra subject to add to my General Certificate of Education exams to bring their number to around 10. By the way, I only just squeaked through with a bare pass in New Testament. I didn't think that religion was stupid, but I did think of it as an historical phenomenon rather than a live modern option. Like many young people, I was interested in establishing my own freedom and living my own life, and Christianity sounded like an unwelcome moral constraint that would tell me to do things that I didn't want to do or tell me not to do things that I did want to do, and that was not attractive. I went to Cambridge University as an undergraduate to study mathematics and physics, and of course I made many friends there. And two of my closest friends turned out to be Christians. Not just nominal Christians, they took their faith quite seriously. I'd met people like that before, but the most important new factor was that as I got to know these Christian friends really quite well, I found their lives attractive. They were, like me, top scholarship students. They were amazingly intelligent. And they didn't seem to be the sort of dour, puritanical killjoys the way that Christians are so often portrayed. Indeed, they seemed to find that their faith gave them a purpose and a meaning and a joy. And that intrigued me. Now, what brought me to the point of taking Christianity seriously for myself, though, was a series of lectures that were given by Michael Green. He was a Christian preacher who came to Cambridge in my second year to lead an evangelistic mission. And my friends invited me to go with them to the lectures. And much to their surprise, I said yes. The content of the lectures was later published in a book entitled Jesus Spells Freedom. So if you like, you can find out what Michael Green actually said. But it was pretty straightforward Christian gospel. But let me try to reconstruct instead my impression, the way the lectures came to me or struck me at the time. The two most enduring new ideas that came across to me were that the Christian understanding of God and of life makes profound sense of our experience of the world, and secondly, that the Christian message is not so much a call to moral living as it is an invitation to a personal relationship. These seem to me new ideas. Perhaps those of you here who are Christians and understand the faith will wonder how the intellectual integrity of Christianity and the idea that Jesus wants us to know him personally could have been new ideas, given my school background. But I can only say they seemed new to me. I began to take seriously the evidence that Jesus really did rise from the dead, and that if that is the case, then it implies that he is who he says he was. Before this lecture series ended, then, I realized that I was more than halfway persuaded that Christianity was true. And I also realized that the only way I was going to find out for sure whether it was true was to do something about it. Christian conviction, though it's not irrational, is not purely intellectual. That was clear to me. A relationship with Jesus was not going to be something that I could enter into purely on the basis of an intellectual analysis. Jesus himself called for repentance, a change of heart, not just of mind. And the New Testament church taught that being able to say Jesus is Lord with personal commitment was the gateway into the Christian life. And so one evening in my college room, I prayed, confessing my sins and asking Jesus to forgive me and to be my Lord. And I was baptized a few months later on my 20th birthday in the chapel of King's College, Cambridge. A few of my non-Christian friends told me I was committing intellectual suicide to become a Christian. But it didn't seem that way to me then, and it has not seemed so since. I was already pretty familiar with the scientific description of the world that I'd set out in my studies to master. And it never seemed to me that reconciling what science had discovered about nature with the Christian message was overwhelmingly problematic, provided one avoided turning physics into metaphysics. The fact that I could experience a personal walk with Jesus and perceive by faith the actions of God in the world did not and does not seem inconsistent with the regularities of nature. Provided one does not elevate those regularities, those reproducibilities, the laws of nature, into an inviolable article of faith, it seems to me perfectly reasonable to see them as the way God normally works in the world, normally orders the world, but not something that God is inevitably bound to. So, in conclusion then, my answer to the question in the title of this forum, is there truth beyond science, is yes. If you understand clearly what science is, then of course there is truth, knowledge, outside of its purview. Indeed, science depends for its own functioning on all sorts of unscientific knowledge. For example, the understanding of human language or of logic. Christian faith is not at all unique in depending upon knowledge beyond science. That doesn't make it irrational or without evidentiary support. Nevertheless, Christianity is not just an impersonal intellectual question. It is a deep, life-changing truth. And it's a matter of our personal relationship with the one who created everything, including nature itself. Thank you.
And now for a contrasting perspective, Dr. Weisberg.
This is where it's not a duel, right? So I'd like to thank all of you for being here. I have to say, Ian's not actually a Penn professor, so he can say that it's okay to not be studying for midterms. I'm not so sure, but I do appreciate all of you being here on this evening, and it's quite a privilege to get to share a stage with such a distinguished scientist and to explore some of the issues that are put before us tonight. So I want to actually begin where Ian ended on the question that has been put to us this evening, and that's the question of, is there truth beyond science? Just as a preliminary, I have to say I am not 100% comfortable defining science the way that Ian does. I think that there's obviously the kind of Enlightenment conception of science as simply knowledge, but there's also a broader conception of science that maybe encompasses a bit more than he's saying. But I think we can set some of these differences aside for tonight, and actually I'll just concede to him science as he means it, where he says science means the natural sciences, biology, chemistry, physics, geology, and so forth. And what I want to, and I think if we construe the term narrowly to mean those things, and we ask, is there truth beyond science? The answer, as Ian just said, is obviously yes. History, sociology, philology make claims. Those claims could be either true or false. Those fields have the resources to investigate the truth of those claims, and so at this kind of superficial level, it's absolutely the case that we agree there is truth beyond science, and it might look like there's no disagreement, and then we can just have a beer, which I think that sounds good right about now. But I want to kind of go a little deeper. So we're going to reserve the term science for natural science, but I also want to talk about a set of inquiries that are not simply any kind of knowledge, but instead a set of inquiries that, let's call them empirical inquiries. So when I say empirical inquiries, I mean the kinds of disciplines that use observations and tests, so observations of various sorts and tests, including experiments, but any other kind of intervention, to learn about the world. So empirical inquiry in this sense is going to be the natural sciences, but also the three that I mentioned before, history, sociology, philology, just as three examples. I would say this would include all of the social sciences and parts of the humanistic subjects. But also it would include a lot of everyday things too. So I have a 3-month-old at home, and he's just recently learned about his hands and his feet. So every morning he wakes up, and we're trying to sleep, but he's sitting there going like this and getting very, very excited looking at his hands. And I mean, that kind of activity that comes very naturally to human beings and to some non-human animals, and that's at one extreme, what 3-month-olds can do, and at the other extreme we can do mathematical physics. And I see all of these as on a scale. And things get more sophisticated, our interventions get more sophisticated, we can use mathematics, including differential equations, to describe these things, but in the end of the day, I think there's a lot of unity in this domain of empirical inquiry. So to me, the really substantial question to ask is there truth beyond empirical inquiry? What's special about empirical inquiry? Because obviously, as you can imagine, I think it's special and there probably isn't much truth beyond it. Maybe there is, and we can talk about that later. And are there non-empirical avenues by which we can come to know truths? And if so, how do they stack up against these empirical ones? So if you've come with me this far, and we're thinking about empirical inquiry or science in this broader sense, but not so broad as to include any human inquiry, we can ask what's so special about inquiring about the world using observation and intervention, or observation and experiment. And here are 3 desiderata, meaning good things, about any kind of inquiry. And I'm going to say that empirical inquiry scores especially highly on these 3 desiderata. So the first one I'll call intersubjectivity. The second one I'll call reliability. And the third one I'll call correctability. And so let me tell you what I mean by these. Intersubjectivity means that if I have good reasons to believe something, then the reasons that I have should be accessible to others. So for example, to take something that Ian and I have in common, I once thought that all swans were white. And then you go to Canberra, the capital of Australia, and you find, oh wow, there are black swans. So I could take you with me next time I go to Canberra and show you these black swans, or I could bring you a picture, and I can share with you these observations that have led me to revise my beliefs. So these observations, or in some, obviously when we do experiments, we do the same sort of thing, they're intersubjectively available. I can share them with you. They're not private. So that's one, I think, desiderata of a good kind of inquiry, desideratum of a good kind of inquiry, and empirical inquiry scores very highly on this test. The second one is reliability. What I mean by this is that we want our beliefs to be generated by reliable processes. People can form beliefs for all sorts of reasons. So Carl Sagan very famously talked about smoking pot in order to come up with ideas to then test. But the point is, he could come up with those beliefs by smoking pot, but that we wouldn't think of that as a reliable process for belief formation. There has to be the right sort of connection between the world and my belief that something is the case in order to actually trust that. Perhaps the most controversial thing I'll say is the only process we know about that reliably creates this right kind of connection between our beliefs and the world is empirical inquiry. And in any case, as I'll conclude with, if you think that you have a method of learning about the world that's non-empirical, then I think you owe it to explain how it can be reliable. Again, which means that we can explain how the connection between my belief that something is true and facts about the world can come together and be connected in the right way. Finally, the third desideratum of inquiry, I think, is correctability. So we all know that our senses sometimes deceive us, and maybe more importantly, politicians and advertisers deceive us, and really smart people are wrong about things, and how do we deal with this? Similarly, our intuitions are often wrong. So I intuit that my students understood the material, and then I give a midterm and I see I was wrong. Or when I put my hand in the freezer to pick up something frozen, to pick up some ice cream for the evening, my folk physics, my intuitive understanding of physics tells me that I'm putting my hand in the freezer and cold is going from the freezer into my hand, but thermodynamics tells me that I'm wrong. There is no quantity. Aristotle and folk physics are wrong. There's just heat, and it flows in or it flows out. So heat is flowing from my hand to the freezer, not cold from the freezer to my hand. How can these things be revised? How can we deal with our senses deceiving us, politicians and advertisers deceiving us, our intuitions being wrong? Well, again, observation, and test. So, as I say, these kinds of inquiries, empirical inquiries, meet these three desiderata especially well. And if someone wants to say that there's truth beyond the empirical, I think we need to ask, can that meet these things equally well? And if not, then tell us why it's okay not to, or if it doesn't meet one of the three criteria, tell us why that's okay. Or I suppose if someone says they have another kind of inquiry in general about the world that's as reliable as empirical inquiry, we want to know, like I said at the beginning, about the epistemology of this inquiry. We want to know how can our minds be hooked up to the world in the right sort of way. So that's my general orientation here. It's not that I think that all of knowledge is exhausted by natural science. I mean, Alex Rosenberg, he's a hard man to know exactly what he says, but that is a fairly stark thing that he says. And I actually sent him an email about it, and he said, yeah, I really don't think that there's a whole lot of knowledge that comes out of history because it's about singular events. But I think that that's very much too far. I think that we can learn about the world in all sorts of, with all sorts of disciplines, but I think what they have in common is this observation and test. I wanted to close on what I take to be the real impulse behind the question about is there truth behind science, and that's really, is there a conflict between science and religion? Now, what Ian said to us is, actually he said it a little bit subtly, but in his book he says it very explicitly, that there's really no conflict between science and religion, only a conflict between scientism and religion. Scientism being the belief that there's really nothing, there's no knowledge beyond the natural sciences, is the way that he defines it. And I certainly appreciate the sentiment behind this, and I certainly agree that there are many, many ways of being religious scientists. We have many examples of them, including one on the stage with us. But I think that if you ask a question like, is there a conflict, I think that the conflict between scientism and religion can be real, but that there may be additional conflicts that we want to ask about. And I think that then, if we're going to ask about those, sort of nebulous talk about religion in general is not going to help us. I think it'd be better to talk about particular claims made by particular religions or particular people or particular religious texts and ask if those sorts of claims are compatible with scientific knowledge, scientific theories, scientific methods, and so forth. And as you might expect, I would like to be very bold here, but I have to give you the wishy-washy answer to say some of them are and some of them are not. It seems to me that the literal truth of the first two chapters of Genesis, if you take the first two chapters of Genesis to be literal records of history, or the parting of the Red Sea, or the revelation at Sinai, are incompatible with things that we know about the world through empirical inquiry. Could they ever be resolved? Perhaps, but it's not as if there's no conflict. I think we kid ourselves if we pretend that there's not. You can, of course, take these things non-literally, as many religious scientists that I know do. You can take them as guiding myths, or expressing emotion, or moral sentiment, or as simple ways of understanding a complex world written a long time ago. But if you are talking about a proposition like the Earth was actually created in 6 days, that's just not compatible with physics as we know it. The last thing that I wanted to say is just kind of a response to thinking about Ian as he was talking. As I've said, I completely agree that history has knowledge and that historical inquiry can tell us true things about the world. But I would point out that when Ian was elaborating on why he thinks history can tell us about the world, he said, well, history has historical methods and historical sources of evidence. Well, what are they? Documents, eyewitness accounts, archaeology, the psychology of human beings, and so forth. And I think that these are all obviously empirical matters. Now, they're not things that we can always do experiments on, although even that's a kind of matter of grain. One of my graduate students said that you must mention the Linsky experiment. This is a literal replaying of life's tape. So Linsky started 10 bacterial colonies, and he lets them evolve, and then freezes them at certain points. Then he can pull them back out of the freezer and start the history again from the point that they stopped. So I mean, at one extreme, you really can do some experiments on historical sciences, but more often than not, when we're talking about singular events, what we have to do is piece things together by looking at empirical sources. But notice that these, I think, are not different in kind and only different in degree from a lot of other things that we do. As we move away from talking about mathematical physics to talking about natural history to talking about doing geology, we do a lot of reconstructing events on the basis of meager but multiple lines of evidence. And these are not then matters of faith or matters of intuition or anything else. They really are matters of empirical inquiry. They involve observations and tests and the gathering of empirical evidence. So with that, I would thank you for your kind attention, and I really look forward to continuing the discussion.
Well done, gentlemen.
Thank you.
On the one hand, we have scientia, scientism, and the limits thereof. On the other hand, we have empirical methods. These are different categories. Let's have each person take a turn responding to what the other has said about the appropriateness of these categories.
Yeah, can I jump in?
Please.
I got to respond to you already, I think.
You know, it might be a problem that we end up agreeing on too much. But you've put forward something which you contrast and you called it the empirical method, and you've described it as having certain desiderata. Mm-hmm. One is intersubjectivity and one is reliability. But of course, those are exactly the same two categories that I've offered up, effectively. I talk about reproducibility, and I talk about clarity. I'm just a scientist. I don't use these other long words. So I think we agree, actually, that those are desiderata, and I would say for natural sciences, they are more than desiderata, that natural sciences essentially insists upon them, and that without them, you're not talking about what I mean by science, in other words, the natural sciences. So while on the one hand, you have said, yes, of course, if you just mean by science, natural sciences, then there is knowledge beyond that. You've turned around and you seem to be wanting to have it both ways, because you want to say that nevertheless, the characteristics that you, Ian, have put forward as being the characteristics of science are really the characteristics of something I'm going to call more broadly empiricism, mm-hmm. Okay? Mm-hmm. And I'm going to say that if something isn't empirical, then there's something wrong about it, or that if it doesn't have those kinds of desiderata, then it perhaps is at best a second-class kind of a knowledge. And that's where I think we would part ways, is because I want to say, no, that's not the case. That what is happening there is a demarcation between what I call science, meaning natural science, and other forms of knowledge, which in the end actually don't possess the possibilities of proceeding in the ways that what I say science does. So I would, for example, say to you, okay, let's say, how would one determine the presence or absence of justice mm-hmm. empirically? Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't think justice or beauty are things that are going to lend themselves to empirical investigation in the sense that you mean. Mm-hmm. And yet I believe that one can have a knowledge of justice, of beauty, and so forth, but it tends to come in other categories. Mm-hmm. And it tends to be in terms of knowledge that is actually far beyond empiricism or beyond science.
Mm-hmm. So I guess I'd like to actually talk about justice and beauty, but I wanted to talk about history and those sorts of things for a moment. I mean, I did intend this to be blurring the line, I think on purpose, because I think that as you say, I have a different terms, but essentially for the same kinds of criteria, because we agree about natural science and why it exemplifies many good epistemic qualities. And then what I'd like to do is to say, when we think about science, even thinking about the natural sciences, but if we pull away from physics and start looking at dealing with really complex systems in biology, or dealing with the kinds of questions that geologists are thinking about, that looks more and more like what historians are doing. It looks more and more like the reconstruction of the authorships of texts. Now, all of those things, there's still a line then when we get to the domains of value as opposed to the domains of facts. And I'd be happy to say that there's a line there. And then I think there's a very interesting question, and a very difficult philosophical question about, do we want to ascribe knowledge claims in domains, in these other domains? Let's talk about art for a moment. I think moral claims are harder. I think that the aesthetic ones are easier. So one possibility, at least, is to say that Of course, there are, we agree that, and these are just the trivial cases, there are claims about who painted this painting, but then that's in the empirical domain. But if you want to say this is the most beautiful symphony is the Seventh Symphony, Beethoven's Seventh Symphony, then that's a purely aesthetic claim. And I guess I don't think that this is something that could be true or false. This is something that expresses an aesthetic attitude. You might think that what plays the equivalent role of truth and falsity in this domain is beauty, is beautiful or not beautiful, or something like that. So I think there can be objectivity, but I think I would not want to say that that's truth in the sense that it's factive. I don't think that there are those kinds of facts. There are facts about what people find beautiful, but if you say that this is the most beautiful symphony, or that this is beautiful, or that this isn't beautiful, whether you think that those judgments are objective or not, it doesn't seem that they're helpfully described as being factive. Now, can there be knowledge? Well, the very traditional definition of knowledge is justified true belief, and if there's not a truth of the matter, then we could call it knowledge, but it's not knowledge in the same kind of sense. So I think that's what I would say about those domains. I think the moral domains I would say something similar, that the right or wrong or sort of just or unjust seem to be similar notions to true or false, but I think it's hard to escape the idea that murdering children is wrong. That sounds like a true statement to me. So I think we'd have to think a lot about how we would actually get those statements to come out true. I mean, a lot of philosophers work on this topic, and I think they both have the intuition that those statements can be true or false, and also don't have really good ideas of how that can work, and often end up giving deflationary accounts that turn those things into descriptions of sentiment that somehow doesn't sit well with us. So I think that these are really, really interesting questions. And maybe you think of me as a splitter and you're a lumper or something like that. But I'd like to try to keep these domains, as you say, they can have their own logics, and I think it's important to respect that. Maybe I've spoken enough about this.
I think there's a sense in which we agree, but I think there are some certain senses in which I would insist that the statement, that Johann Sebastian Bach was a great musician is something that you can say is either true or false, okay? And so it doesn't seem very helpful to say about aesthetic questions that they're not questions that you can say true or false about. I mean, I think that, that there is real knowledge in music, in art, in other aesthetic things about the content and about not just about the peripheries, as you say, about who painted it and so forth, but about the content. So I think I would disagree.
What do you think is the content of? I mean, in the end, what's the content of Bach was a great composer? Do you think it's
a recognition of beauty in music, and if you want to ask, well, what does that beauty consist of? You can't find that beauty out by a kind of scientific analysis. You have to do the kinds of analysis that musicians do. So you have to speak about Johann Sebastian Bach in musical terms, by and large. And so, of course, musicians have developed an enormous vocabulary and way of talking about music and trying to understand what makes it beautiful or makes it in such a way that it's appealing, whether there's an inner logic to it, whether it expresses some emotion or some connection to the human heart. And of course, all of these things are not scientific, so you can't sort of measure them, but I think that they're real.
I guess I think the content, though, that Bach was a great composer is really that people think he was a great composer. But then if you say he wrote beautiful music, then I think, like you say, there are ways that musicians and people that study music think about assessing that. You might even think there are objective criteria for that, but I think that comes down to, as you say, matters of beauty. And matters of beauty, I guess I don't think of as, these are not domains of knowledge except in this kind of very derivative sense, that that's its kind of own domain. Now I guess I would say that all of these things, though, they all have an inner logic, and I think that's something that we're agreeing about. All of them, though, look a little different than when someone says that this is a completely personal thing that's accessible only to me. So I mean, you can, even without having truth, you can have intersubjectivity. So even if you accepted the idea that there's no truth in moral matters, we can still agree that we can say what it means to have an objectively moral system is that we can come to agree about it. And one of the things that looks different to me than things like appeals to personal revelation is this intersubjectivity. So one thing that I think could be worth reflecting on is like, how does that play out? I mean, I'm the oddball in this room, I think, but I think it's a question that I am legitimately interested in. I mean, well, it's often why we use the term faith for those kind of things.
I wanted to pick
right?
up the third thing that you said, which was, I don't know whether it was a desiderata or quite what it was, but it was correctability.
Yes. Yeah.
So you referred to correctability. I think that's a very important point. Mm-hmm. It's often said by the critics of religion that what's good about science and about empiricism is that it's correctable, whereas faith is not correctable. I mean, the implication is that faith lacks that correctability. Mm-hmm. I don't actually accept that. I don't think it's historically true in the first place. I mean, I don't say you're saying that, but I'm saying it is a common critique mm-hmm. by those who criticize religion. I think there is a clear sense in which, if you take Christianity, for example, Christianity has grown. Of course, it is founded and centered on the personality and life and work of Jesus Christ, but Christianity is not static. It isn't that it's never changed, and in certain senses, it's correctable. I mean, it used to be the case. You know, if you asked anyone in the 16th century, you know, whether the sun goes round the earth or the earth goes round the sun, you know what answer you'd have got. They'd have said the sun goes round the earth. Well, hardly any Christians today would dream of saying that, okay? So in matters to do with nature, it is in fact the case that the Christian church has changed its position about some of them. And this, by the way, bears on this question of whether there is overlap, which you also raised very interestingly. I mean, I wouldn't for a moment say there's no overlap between the claims of Christianity, let's say, and science. There is overlap. That's one of the things that's wrong about the writings of Stephen Jay Gould, who wrote a book, you know, that referred to this NOMA, non-overlapping magisteria. He claimed that there was no overlap between the topics of religion and science, and therefore there could never be a disagreement. I wouldn't say that for a moment, okay? I don't think that's true. I think that the interests and the truth claims of Christianity and modern science, for example, do overlap, and that they are sometimes mutually correcting and constraining. But anyway, so I would say it's clear to me that there is a sense in which religion, at least Christianity, can be correctable, but it's not in quite the same way that we think of science. But then actually, we're usually offered a very much of a caricature of the way that science's correctability works. That's a whole nother topic.
But this would be fun. We should do that talk sometime. That would be great.
And that is probably a good time for us to take our break on the note that 1, the Earth goes round the sun, and 2, Bach was a great composer.
We can't disagree with those things.
Some points of agreement, always good to have. Again, take the next 3 minutes, fill out your response cards, tweet some more questions or text, and we will be sorting through them. And we'll come back in just a few minutes. Let's start off with a question. Let's see. Let me pull it out so that I can read it a little bit more accurately. Let's see. What does the history of strife between science and religion? Let's pull out some examples: Hypatia, Galileo, Scopes trial, etc. What does that tell us about the possibility of synthesis or getting along between the two subjects?
I mean, you could talk about cases where you have religious scientists too, including Newton and many of the figures in scientific revolution. So I guess I don't think that it tells us a lot at this very, very general level. But I think, just to take the most recent of those examples, the Scopes trial, or even more recently in Dover, Pennsylvania in 2005, it becomes a problem when there's a well-established set of scientific facts, and for political reasons, people want to teach otherwise. So I'm not really sure how we can generalize from this, but simply to say that there are cases where if we're talking about evolution as in that case, there are plenty of religious biologists who say, I have found ways to think about these as being compatible ideas, and then there are people that insist on the literal truth of Genesis, and there is a conflict. And so I think a lot has to do with if one wants to be religious and one wants to accept scientific theories, being open to different avenues of learning about the world. But I'm curious what Ian thinks.
Well, first thing I would say is that to refer to the warfare between science and religion, or science and theology, is in a certain sense to subscribe to what I would regard as a myth. And you already alluded to the fact that if you look at history, particularly the founders of the scientific revolution, were by and large religious people. So they didn't see there as being an inherent contradiction between what they were doing in developing science and their Christian faith. There are some notable examples, and Galileo obviously ran into serious problems with the Roman Curia for a variety of reasons, and historians have studied this in great depth and will tell you about all the other reasons far beyond this question of cosmology that led to the conflict between Galileo and the Roman Church. But I would say that backing up, it's true that today there are often conflicts, and these very often, as Michael has suggested, arise around what I would call literalistic approaches to interpreting the Holy Scriptures. And in a certain sense, there are two groups of people who insist upon a literal interpretation of Genesis. And these are the extreme conservative evangelical wing of the Christian church and the militant atheists. You get it? The militant atheists want to portray the only option about the Bible as being, that the earth was created in literal 6 days, because then they can say, yeah, that conflicts with science, okay? But that isn't the only option that Christians have ever had, and it certainly isn't the only option we have today.
I just would add, or maybe a slight disagreement. I mean, the militant atheists, I think, to be fair, the position is not that this is the only way that you can read it, but it's if you read this as making claims about the natural world, then they must be rejected. And unfortunately, the people that push political agendas in places like Dover, Pennsylvania, do read it this way. So I think it's easy to find, I assume you're talking about people like Daniel Dennett, Richard Dawkins, it's easy to find them saying things, reading these texts literally, but I think it's because they're responding to actual political facts, at least in the United States, which unfortunately this is something that's happening. All of these other ways of reading it are of course available, and it would be good for everybody if people were more aware of them, perhaps.
But in slight defense of my characterization, it's not just in areas of science that they do this. They do this in all sorts of areas of interpretation of the Old Testament. So they speak in condemnation of Old Testaments, talking about some of the Old Testament passages which refer to stoning people caught in adultery and so forth, and they point to how barbaric that is, as if the Christian church teaches that today, which of course it doesn't, okay? So clearly, when you approach the Scriptures, when Christians approach the Scriptures, Christians of any type approach the Scriptures, there's a job of interpretation to be done. And I think in general, my critique of the anti-theists of this century is that they have a very, very simplistic view of the Bible, and it's that very simplistic view of the Bible is what they attack.
Let's move on, since
picking
on Dawkins is pretty easy.
He'll be here in a couple of weeks. He'll be here in a couple of weeks. You can all come and do it then if you like.
We don't want to take anything away from his talk. Let's move on to another question. This one concerning evidence. So, Ian, in the previous section, you told us about some of your beliefs. which are beyond science, which are not scientific beliefs, your faith, what types of evidence do you rely on for beliefs beyond science? And then the response will be, what do you think of those types of evidence in light of your statements about empirical truth?
Well, as I more or less suggested, I find the historic evidence surrounding the person of Jesus, a lot of it very persuasive, very clear. Sometimes people will argue, well, was there a person, Jesus? I think it's kind of obvious that there was. And so I think when you begin to take seriously and you look into the question of who was this Jesus, what happened, what did he teach, what happened to him, did the resurrection take place? As I said, that's one of the things which I think has always been a crucial part of Christian teaching. It's certainly what the earliest followers of Jesus proclaimed, was that Jesus had risen from the dead. So the sorts of questions that one should look, if one wants to investigate intellectually the questions of Christianity, I think would be focused on that person of Jesus and trying to understand who he was and whether the things that are said and written about him are true. And I think, as I said, that those are largely sort of much more historical questions, or in a certain sense, they're forensic questions in the technical sense, rather than there being scientific questions. And that's why I think that when one approaches these questions, you have to form a judgment, an opinion, based on those types of questions. And methods that have much more in common with history than they do with science. So those types of arguments have been written about extensively over the years, and there are many books that you can read. When I became a Christian, there were books like Who Moved the Stone by Frank Morrison. These days, it's The Case for Christ, Lee Strobel, and people like that. These are the popular books where people look at this question and try to think through whether this is a persuasive case. I don't think in the end it's going to be a knockdown proof one way or the other. And it isn't, for me, I wouldn't say a knockdown proof, intellectual proof of Christianity. But that's nevertheless, I think, the case that there is evidence and there are good arguments that would support a Christian viewpoint.
Mm-hmm. Well, I would just say that insofar as we're saying that the way to evaluate a question like what was the historical Jesus like is to look at the body of historical evidence and to approach this in a forensic way, couldn't agree more. I think we may disagree about how we weigh the details of the evidence, but I think that is the empirical method. This is the thing that we would agree about. Now, I think, since I suspect whoever asked the question wanted to push this along a little bit to talk about why might someone be an atheist, let's say. I think that there are a couple of options here. So one thing that's kind of common to say in more theologically sophisticated circles are, if you take this empiricist line that I've been taking, the best that you could be, or the worst that you could be, whoever you're asking, is an agnostic, and say that there's just no evidence one way or the other, especially if you understand God in a traditional way as a kind of beyond nature, being omniscient, omnipotent, and omnibenevolent. So then I think that you might say, well, what kinds of arguments could make you an atheist? So for some people, like the militant atheists that Ian was mentioning, I wonder if they like the term militant atheist. They don't. Probably not, yeah. But let's just call it the professional atheists that you're mentioning. I
sometimes call them anti-theists. Okay.
Whatever they are, I think that they take propositions like God exists to be something that would admit of a simple empirical test. And I think one of the reasons, I guess I know Dawkins best on this kind of subject, and I think it's because Dawkins really believes that the question of the existence of God is tied to the problem of apparent design in biology. So he really believes that the world, he accepts with the traditional theists, at least the theists of the 19th century, that the world looks like it's full of design in the biological world, and that until Darwin came along, the best explanation of that design was the existence of God. But now that we have an explanation, a natural explanation for what looks like design in the world. He thinks that the kind of last remaining reason that you could accept the existence of God has been removed, and then that's a kind of empirical refutation of the existence of God. So that's, I think, where someone like Richard Dawkins believes that why he thinks that there's an empirical test. That, so if you look in the history of science, God was invoked to explain all sorts of things in the natural world. One by one, they fall away. Many of them fall away in the scientific revolution. Maybe some fall in the chemical revolution. And the last straw that broke the camel's back was evolutionary theory. Maybe some of you think that we still haven't quite nailed down how consciousness arises from the brain, so maybe there's still that one. But in any case, that one's probably coming, so once that happens, it'll be gone. I actually think that this is, I kind of am more of an empiricist than that, and so I think that on empirical grounds, you could just say there's not evidence one way or the other. The thing that I think convinces a lot of philosophers who are atheists is the problem of evil. And of course, this is a question that theists also worry about, and how to actually take into account unnecessary natural evil in the world. But I don't know if any of my Phil 1 students are here, but one of the arguments that we actually look at is that it's literally incompatible, the existence of God conceived of traditionally and unnecessary natural evil. So that's a kind of non-empirical way that some philosophers have argued that God cannot exist on this sort of logical metaphysical argument. So those are a couple of thoughts on the question.
All right, very good. Let's move on to another question. I'm going to switch out the one that I was going to do because of something that you said. It connects to another question that I think, well, I get to add one of my own questions, I hope, since I tweet. So you mentioned...
I tweet, therefore I am. Is that what you're thinking?
I tweet, therefore I ask the question. You mentioned rise of consciousness from the brain as an issue that might come up and provide the same type of controversial challenge that natural selection, origin of the species did so long ago. Mm-hmm. What other potential scientific breakthroughs that are on the horizon do you see coming which might present a serious challenge to people of faith trying to reconcile their beliefs with what we have now and may soon discover?
It's a very interesting question. I mean, I actually think that to me it's very surprising that in public discourse in the United States the kind of the anti-science sort of movement really always focuses on evolution, but yet I think the psychologists have not accepted the existence of souls for a long time, and I think that's got to be even more problematic to the same sorts of people. So I think that's the big one. I actually don't. There's nothing that. I mean, there's lots of more of the same, but I think that to me that's the really big frontier is cognitive science, and I just wonder what will happen as people as that becomes part of public discourse more. I'm curious what Ian thinks about this, though. Well, I may be talking to the wrong people.
I think, if you like, the question is, the way I interpret it is what's the bleeding edge of the science-religion controversy, mm-hmm. Okay? Mm-hmm. And I think you're right to allude to topics surrounding, let's say, neuroscience, mm-hmm. because I think there is a way of interpreting what we're discovering about the brain to say that this, okay, I'll measure the blood flow in somebody's brain and the oxygen level in the blood, and I'll get them to think about something. Maybe I'll get them to think about God, and I'll see that certain areas of the brain light up. And people do these experiments, and they're interesting. Okay, I mean these are interesting experiments. Okay, they're not as interesting as people make out, but they're interesting. And so it seems to me, not in the least surprising that there are certain parts of the brain that light up in different ways when you think in different ways or about different topics. But then the leap comes, and there are two types of leap. One is a promissory leap, which is to say, and soon we'll know all about how the brain works. Of course, that's actually not true. We've probably got hundreds of years before we'll actually get down to the cellular level, the rate of progress at the moment. But anyway, maybe we will. Science can do amazing things. But the other leap is that once we got that, which we haven't got yet, but once we have a scientific or physical description of the brain, that will rule out, anything to do with spirituality. Well, actually, but it won't. Because, of course, In the first place, we're going to have to recognize that even if we do have a physical description of how the brain works, that does not rule out the significance of my thoughts. It can't possibly rule out the significance of my thoughts. Because if my thoughts are ruled out by understanding that the brain is just a physical thing, then the fact that I know that it's just a physical thing is ruled out because it's a thought, okay? So there's a deep self-consistency problem that means that even if we have an understanding of how the brain works, it will still be the case that my thoughts are real things that have content, that have meaning, and cannot be gainsaid. In other words, there are descriptions of me as a person at different levels that have to be given credit simultaneously. That having a scientific description of something, for example, the operation of the brain, does not rule out the reality of descriptions at other levels, for example, at the level of consciousness or at the level of logic or whatever it might be. I'm sure Michael agrees with this.
Well, I'd actually love to speak about just that, but I do want to just talk about one thing that you said in the middle. I mean, I think you started to put your finger, I think, on let me just say, here's the inference that worries some people. It's not, of course, first of all, I agree about the rate of progress. It's going to take a long time until we know all of these things. But let's just say that someone was moved by the following argument. And I think everybody needs to acknowledge that people have experiences that can be described as the sublime. And so that can take on a religious, flavor or not, but still it's an experience of the sublime. And that experience is very real and very important part of human experience. Now, religious people often, so if you think about this kind of issue of reliability that we were speaking about before, religious people many times will attribute that to some connection to something external. The concern is if we start to learn about how that can be produced internally and we can give it an alternative explanation, that might cut off a certain kind of inference from the experience of the sublime to an inference about what's causing that experience of the sublime. Just as, I think it has the parallel logic to this kind of Dawkins' point about what happened in 1859, that there was this thing that everyone has to acknowledge, or at least so he says, that the world looks like it's designed, and before it, that was scientific evidence that God must be behind it. And once we have another explanation of that, you break that inference at least. And I think if one was basing religious faith on the connection between the experience of the sublime and what could be causing that experience, that could be deeply problematic. That said, I think
that's not a new problem.
No, of course,
That's
of
not
course.
a new problem.
And neuroscience is not the thing that's solving that. Psychology, in the 19th, William James's book about religious experience already raised these kinds of issues.
So if I have a dream, and I can attribute it to, God speaking to me, or I can attribute it to the fact that, I had very indigestible dinner last night.
That's right.
That's a problem that's existed for millennia. Of course. Okay? And so obviously there is an issue to do with interpretation of experience and the extent to which people who are inclined to to interpret their experience with reference to God or the supernatural, have to do some kind of interpretation. But I would argue that that is in itself not a new problem.
I completely agree with you, yeah.
Very well. Let's move on to a...
You don't usually hear those words, right?
Let's move on to another question that we got via text. This is a compound question, so I'll just throw it out there and we'll get some responses. So, at the point at which religion attempts to describe scientific phenomena, say evolution, et cetera, aren't we obliged to use a scientific lens of scrutiny over those religious claims? And a follow-up question on that, as science continues to expand, does religious truth, if in conflict with it, become less and less relevant?
I think that's probably aimed at me, that question mostly, is it? Well, anyway, let me have a shot at it, okay? First of all, I do think that if you're asking scientific questions, the best way to address those questions is through science. And I think that, so in a certain sense, to the first part of that question, I'm going to say science is actually the best way to find out about the world insofar as it is characterized by this reproducibility and clarity that I've argued are the characteristics of science. And that describes a lot of what goes on in the natural world. So, I think that the universe is very old, and I think that, fundamentally, physics shows us that, and it's rather convincing. So, and that's the reason why, as I said earlier, it makes complete sense that Christians these days do not assert that the sun goes round the earth. Mm-hmm. They've been corrected by the fact that we've got extremely good scientific evidence to say the contrary. And now, of course, there are sometimes stresses and strains in making a transition in that way. And so in the case of the arguments that Galileo had, that certain factions within the church would argue, well, no, the scriptures say that the earth is stationary and unmoved, and that means that the earth can't be moving. And that was their interpretation of the scriptures in favor of the schoolman's view of what orbits what. But eventually they realized that that's an unreasonable interpretation of a poetic description of the relationship of things in the earth. And so they come to a new position. So I think historically it's clearly the case that the natural sciences have, in some cases, corrected viewpoints, cosmological understandings, and brought them to a new understanding, which is consistent with our understanding of the world by science.
So let me just ask you about something that's kind of a place where I think many mainstream Christians would still resist the scientific picture. I mean, the scientific picture is that human beings are great apes. That we were talking about natural selection. That's a part of evolutionary theory that is easier to accept, perhaps. But the phylogenetic side of it suggests that humans are not unique. They're not, different than all the other animals, just below the angels. I think that seems to me to remain a kind of difficulty for even fairly progressive Christian theologians. So I'm curious how you see that.
Well, of course, Christians think that humans are, in a certain sense, special. Christian teaching is that humanity is, in a certain sense, has certain special things about it as a race, as beings, and a certain relationship with God, which is taught in the scriptures and which is part of what our Christian faith is. My own view of the approaches to the understanding of the Genesis, the early chapters of Genesis and so forth, doesn't lead me to believe that the Christian message is inconsistent with there having been some evolution, with us being mammals at the same time that we are humans. So, I think most Christians would be comfortable with saying we are mammals. To call us great apes is really a way of saying something slightly more than that. It's a way of saying we're mammals, and the way we became what we were was by a certain historical view, namely evolution. I think it's hard for most Christians to talk about evolution because evolution is something that means different things to different people. Mm-hmm. It can be something as simple as the fact that it's a dangerous time to go to hospitals. If you want to keep out of hospitals because hospitals are full of drug-resistant bacteria. Mm-hmm. And the reason why hospitals are full of drug-resistant bacteria is that those bacteria have evolved to get resistance to the antibiotics that are used in large quantities in hospitals. So in that sense, we know biological evolution can take place. Mm-hmm. But that isn't a lot of the time what people mean by evolution. At the other end of the spectrum, what is often meant by evolution is a story that says that everything we see in the world came to pass by evolution, and that rules out the possibility that God had anything to do with it. Okay? And so between those two extremes is, in my view, a place where one can be comfortable with the view that common descent, which is now something which is got rather strong scientific evidence in its support through genomics and so forth, probably is the way that biological diversity arose on the Earth. But I don't think that that is in contradiction with the view that the Earth is created by God and that God was a creator. And it comes back to the fact that it has always been the case that Christians and other religious people, for that matter, have been willing to say of things that have a natural explanation, that they may also have a supernatural explanation, or an explanation in terms of the actions of God. Mm-hmm. And that those two things can be simultaneously true.
I'd love to keep going if we can stay on this thread, but it looks like we can't, so.
We're going to have to wrap things up. Unfortunately, we've got a lot of good back and forth responses that could still go on. We have so many good questions that I wish I could read. Questions like, is the King of France bald? And why does it matter?
It's the present King of France. You want to get that right.
Questions concerning the implications of Gödel's incompleteness theorem, which I'm rather fond of.
We'd let you speak about that.
Yeah, well, exactly.
We're not going to let the moderator take over. I think perhaps the best thing to do to wrap up would be to give each of you a chance to summarize the one point that you want to get across to the audience about what you have said. Maybe, if you're feeling charitable, you could say one point that you have picked up from the other person's discussion that you find especially helpful, or maybe even compelling, and we will end it with that. Shall we flip a coin to see who gets the last word? Let's leave it to luck. Got one. Heads or tails?
Tails.
Tails. Proceed. Oh, no, I said to get the last word. Okay, you get the last word. You go first, then you. There we go.
Okay. Well, I think, just to summarize, the most important thing that I think helps me understand the relationship between science and Christianity, but for that matter, science and a whole lot of other important disciplines and questions in which I think there is truth as well as knowledge, is to recognize this last point that I was trying to make, that when science has offered a description of a phenomenon, that does not explain away descriptions of the same phenomena at different levels. That's true within science, by the way. In science we have different levels of description. We have physics, we have chemistry, we have biology, and so forth. So if I think about myself as a person, yes, I am, assembly of quarks and leptons. I am, atoms of oxygen and carbon and calcium and phosphorus and so forth. I am a complicated biochemical machine. I am a mammal, and I am a human, and I am a father, and I am a person. And none of those things rules out the others. And no more do I believe that it rules out a description of me which says that I am a sinner saved by grace.
So I would say that I also think that there are, if you would like to call them, different levels of description, but the ones that are within the empirical realm, of course, it can be described how they relate to one another. And one needn't be a kind of crude reductionist to say that ultimately we're aiming for a scientific picture where all of these things fits together. And I think that these are not all the same sorts of things. To describe ourselves as in ways that require interpretation as sinners or as fathers are quite different than saying that we're assemblages of molecules on the one hand or mammals on the other. But to pick up on the request that you made, I think I have a much greater appreciation for, even than reading Ian's book, in understanding why he wants to take disciplines like history and say that they're somewhat unique, and I've really enjoyed having that back and forth. And I also think that this kind of dialogue suggests that there might be productive ways for, you already in one person embody the scientist and the religious person talking with one another, but I actually think that this is been, to me, a much more enlightening discussion between believers and non than many that I've watched. So I really thank you for that. It's really been a pleasure to spend the evening with you. And thank you very much for your moderation.
And on that note, let's thank our speakers.
It's great to talk to you, yeah. Really nice. We didn't really bite to you, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, take it.
Go ahead.
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at veritas.org.